You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
M.J. Rose.
At the end of the show, we're going to have an audiobook excerpt from Richard Fox's The Ember War. This audio clip is narrated by the one and only Luke Daniels, and you're going to love this series. I love it so much, and Richard has been a great supporter and sponsor of the show, and we're going to show him some love. Listen to the audiobook excerpt. You're going to love it, and be sure to go to audible.com to purchase it. If you're not an Audible subscriber, you can get a free book just by signing up for a free trial at audibletrial.com/Hank. You get a 30-day free trial. You get the free book. If you decide to cancel your Audible subscription, you get to keep the free book, and it doesn't cost you a single penny. audibletrial.com/Hank, and listen after the show for the clip from Richard Fox.
Writers, I have an amazing tool to tell you about. A revolutionary writing tool for planning stories. Campfire Pro is what novelists need to go from the seed of an idea to a detailed plan that's ready to be executed. Complete your character design, create a timeline, and track your world building all in one place with our downloadable desktop app for Mac and PC. Without the annoying subscription model so many apps are using today. Visit campfiretechnology.com for special holiday pricing on Campfire Pro today. Who Wants to Love a Billionaire? Billionaires in New York, Book 1 by Laura Burton. Do you have a favorite writer whose books are auto-buys for you? Wouldn't you love for readers to have you on their auto-buy list, then recommend your books to their friends and on social media? The good news is there are subtle things you can do, things that are nearly invisible to the reader, that will make your stories unputdownable. The Beyond 10 Days course from Victory Editing can help you get the most from your stories and help you build that relationship with readers through your writing. This course is full of awesome, and best of all, you don't have to fly across the country or put on pants. In this course, we'll focus on avoiding info dumps, dialogue mechanics, show versus tell in dialogue, carrying show versus tell forward to your narrative, deepening your point of view and strengthening your protagonist's voice, overwriting and how to avoid it. 10 hours of video content with text and audio downloads. Shine that diamond. Join me at the Beyond 10 Days course. Go to hankgarner.com and click the banner to sign up today. The Forsaken Mercenary series by Jonathan Yanez, a near-future thriller series, is now available on audible.com. The series that readers have loved is now available in your favorite format, audiobook format. The first book is called Drop Ship in the Forsaken Mercenary series. If they can't control him, they'll try and kill him. Daniel Hunt is the deadliest mercenary in the galaxy if he can just remember. 5 years before, he woke up with nothing more than his name. Now his present is on a violent collision with his past and the future of the galaxy. The Earth is dead. Humanity is taken to the Moon and Mars to have a chance. On what's left of Earth, primal gangs war for dominance. A rebel force will discover a weapon of unimaginable strength. The wealthy in the galaxy will do anything to possess. As Daniel unravels the origin of his past, he'll realize he's not the same weapon he once was. But does redemption exist for someone like him? For fans of Jason Bourne and the Weapon X program, this one's for you. Grab your hand cannon and start listening now. The Forsaken Mercenary series, Book 1 Drop Ship, available on audible.com now from Jonathan Yanez. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have MJ Rose back on the show with me. She was on the show a couple of years ago talking about her book, Tiffany Blues, and we had a great conversation then. Her new book is called Cartier's Hope, And this is a fantastic read. If you love Tiffany Blues, this book just ratchets up everything about it like another 50%. I love this book so much, MJ. Thank you for taking time to come back on the show today.
Thank you so much.
MJ, last time you told us this great story when I asked you, what your first memory was of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller. And you told us this great story of growing up in New York and being that kid who just really absorbed, the city and the architecture and, traveling by yourself around the city with your face in a book. I love that story so much because you painted this picture of this kid who was just kind of infused with the power of stories. Do you still get excited like that when you look around and absorb what's going on around you?
Oh, definitely, absolutely. I think that's why I write so much about different cities, New York, Paris, places that I go, because I love walking around cities. Yes.
Your books tend to revolve around an historical incident or people or some sort of snippet of history. What was it about this book, Cartier's Hope, that first grabbed your attention?
Well, I was actually in Paris taking classes in there's a school in Paris called L'École, which is a jewelry school that's run by the jewelry firm of Van Cleef and Arpels, and they give different classes. It's not an accredited school, but they do give classes, and it's a fabulous place to learn about jewelry and jewelry making and the history of jewels and gemstones. And I was there doing research for Tiffany Blues, actually, and I was in the class about diamonds, and the teacher was talking about the Hope diamond, and she was talking about the fact that a lot of the bad luck stories associated with the Hope diamond were not true, that they were exaggerated by Pierre Cartier in 1910 when he owned the Hope diamond for 10 months. He bought it in an effort to reset, and he was going to reset it and then sell it. And during that time, Pierre Cartier, who is the son of the creator of the Cartier jewelry concern, Louis Cartier, Pierre was the one who was in London, and one of the other sons was in Paris. They had 3 stores. So Pierre Cartier was the marketing genius of the brothers, and he had this idea that he was going to exaggerate the bad luck about the stone, and that was going to help get it press and attention and make it easier to sell. And it was because at the time, she explained, in 1910 and in 1920s, the idea of spitting in the face of bad luck was very charming. Women bought charms that had the number 13 on them and wore them on bracelets and necklaces. They bought horseshoe.
The show
hung them upside down for bad luck. That for some reason, this whole idea of not paying attention to superstitions and laughing at bad luck had taken hold. And so Cartier thought that if he made a whole big deal about and I was just so utterly fascinated that A, all the stories I'd ever heard were not all true about the Hope, and B, that this jeweler had done this, that he had manipulated the marketplace, and basically was like a brilliant advertising person, which is what I started out as in life. Not a brilliant one, but I've been in advertising my whole life, so people who were in marketing are very interesting to me. So I started doing research on Pierre Cartier and the Hope diamond, and I decided that, and there was this little tiny period that he owned it, these 10 months. And so I decided to base my novel during those 10 months everybody knows about, which is when Evelyn Walsh McLean bought it, and then what happened to her. She's not part of the book. Once the book ends, this isn't a secret, the book ends with right before the stone is purchased. So I don't get into what happened to the stone after Cartier owned it.
What's really funny, MJ, when you start laying out the facts like that, is that there truly is nothing new under the sun. And the more you dig into history and we repeat these same things over and over again, and just different characters, but the human condition is the human condition.
Yeah. And to really make that point further, it's known that Cartier borrowed some of the bad luck stories from a very famous novel that he'd read called The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, that I'm sure a lot of the people listening will have read, and I certainly had read, and it's actually series now, or a movie. I'm not sure what it is. I have planned to watch it, but he took a whole bunch of things from Wilkie Collins' novel and gave them to the stone. For instance, the stone was actually bought by a gem dealer named Tavernier, who went to India and bought it legitimately for actual money from whoever owned it and brought it back to France for the king. But the Cartier story is that Tavernier stole it out of the third eye of an idol in a temple, and was chased out of the temple by rabid dogs. And that was taken from the Moonstone book. So there's a lot of fun stuff like that.
Marketing lives. I'll tell you what.
Yeah.
That's so funny. Last time we talked, we were both kind of lamenting the disappearance of these great big epic stories, like a Mishnah, type book.
Yeah.
When I was reading Cartier's Hope, you really infused the story with a feeling of that kind of epic scope. When you started looking into this, and you've got the historical facts that you mentioned, and there's obviously a novel here. How did you start preparing yourself to paint this landscape that you did for us?
I have no idea. I mean, I do a ton of research. I read fiction written by writers during the period. So, one of the books that I read, a book that I got a used copy out of some crazy place that was really battered, that Edna Ferber had written about a woman reporter that she'd written in 1915, about what it was like to be a woman reporter in 1915 or 1910. I don't remember the exact date. That book was really helpful because, unlike reading newspaper articles, I find that when somebody who's alive during the period I'm writing about writes about the period, there are all kinds of details that I can get that there would be no other way to find out. Sorry about the dog.
It's okay.
There'd be no other way that I could find out, because there's nobody, very few of the things I've written is anybody still alive. That wouldn't be true in the future. About 1910, there's nobody who was a reporter in 1910 who's alive. So that was one of the really interesting. So I do a lot of reading of source material that's written, memoirs that take place during the time period. I go to the New York Public Library and take out magazines and newspapers from the period, pages, and there's a character in this book who's an editor of a newspaper, and it's based on a real newspaper at the time. And I went to the New York Public Library, and I got they still have copies of that newspaper, and I read through, I don't know, I must have gone back 6 times to spend the whole day reading these columns that were written in that newspaper. And that really sort of, I have a Pinterest board. I collect a lot of images, like over 300 to 500 usually, images of the clothes that the people are wearing, of what the streets look like, just everything that I can find, menus from restaurants, because what people eat is, I know it's the same food, it's eggs. I mean, we still have the same things, bread
Right.
and eggs, but the preparations are different, the names of the dishes are very different. There are a lot of things that they ate in 1910 you don't ever hear about. I mean, it was unheard of when you sat down at a restaurant in 1910, like Delmonico's, immediately. And when I was a little girl, they were still doing this in New York. They immediately put on the table was a little silver tray with ice, usually, with celery and carrots and radishes and little raw vegetables, like a little crudité thing. And that was automatic, that went down on the table. So little things like that, there'd be no way to know if you didn't really read and look at source material.
Right. When you're looking for those details and you're making Pinterest boards and excuse me, sorry about that. Collecting newspaper clippings and magazines and all of that sort of stuff. Do you find yourself making notes of vernacular, twist of phrase, turns of phrase, things like that, or are you just kind of soaking in this, and then when it comes to the writing, it just comes out because you've kind of marinated in this 1910 time frame for so long?
More the latter. What I do is I buy a notebook for every book that I one particular notebook from a store called Smythson's, but I get a different colored one for each book based on, I don't know, just the feeling of the book. And the whole time that I'm doing all this research, I am taking notes, but not about the vernacular, for a reason that I'll explain in a minute. So I'm writing down all of my impressions and things I'm reading, and I'm also doing a lot of research on stores and jewelry, and because the book about the businesses that are in the book, because people in my book, what they do for a living is always a big part of the story. So I write down a lot of notes, and I sort of make a journal, and I keep it sort of from the main character's point of view. And then when I'm done doing all my research, I put it aside, and I don't actually look back at it. So it's sort of like absorbing the whole world, and I don't really, once I'm in it enough, I don't look back. I occasionally will open it up to look for something that I specifically remember, but I have a terrible memory, so I don't even remember. I wrote it. It's not like some smart chronological journal. It's just this arbitrary page after page of thoughts. But one of the things I try not to do is use vernacular much at all. I find when I read that if there's too much vernacular in a book, it pulls me out of the story if it's phrases that I really am not used to hearing. And my whole goal when I'm writing is that a reader can hold, and I'm very flattered that my books are very immersive, and people feel like they're stepping into the world inside the book. And so I don't want to do something to pull them out of that. I don't want somebody to have to look up a word in a dictionary in the middle of a paragraph of mine. So I try not to. I look up things like what are pet phrases that people used at that time, so that the guy can call the girl a pet phrase. It might not be the same one that we use now, but it won't be some weird thing you've never heard of.
Gotcha. So in your view, you're using things about the setting to season the story, to give us just enough to help transport us to another place without being so completely immersed that we need a translator to help us.
Well, just in the words. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, just in language, because I do want you, and I do want the street to be almost exact, the
Sure.
food. I mean, I want everything to be as exact as I can make it, but I don't like using too much slang.
Right.
I mean, in Tiffany Blues, I don't remember now what phrase I used, but I think I used something like skidoo. I mean, there was a phrase, but it's something enough people have heard that it wouldn't make you stop and go, what does she mean? But if there was a word that I found in my research that people use that isn't something I even understand, I probably wouldn't use it.
Gotcha. The Hope Diamond is such a great catalyst for the story and such a great framing device for this, but the story's really about Vera Garland. Tell us where Vera came from for you.
Yeah, I keep saying that I'm going to come up with the character first and then write the book, but I keep not doing that, and I keep coming in with an place, a society or a group of people who do something for a living, and then the book comes out of that. So truly, it was the Hope Diamond that started this, when I heard that piece of information. And then it was all sort of backwards engineering. It's like, okay, if somebody, who would care that the stories about the Hope Diamond weren't real, that they were being exaggerated? And this is the weird thing. I always feel so... I don't have any memory of how the characters come into being. I don't remember anything about creating them. I have no idea. Sometimes at some point while I'm doing all that research, I just start to get an idea of something. So when I came back from Paris, having heard that thing about the Hope Diamond, I had to write a paragraph about what the book would be about. I was actually doing the Tiffany Blues and the Cartier's Hope paragraphs at the same time. We're going to a new contract. And so I wrote a paragraph about each book, that's all. And I didn't actually have any idea about what the book, Cartier's Hope was going to be about until I sat down to write the paragraph. And then I just wrote, there's a journalist who discovers that the Hope Diamond is what's being said about it isn't real, and she meets a jeweler who helps her figure out what's going on, and it uncovers something about her life. I mean, it was said better, but it was that kind of thing. And I start doing all that research, and it's during the research and reading about the time period that the characters start to develop. And Vera was special because she was a journalist, and as I started doing the research and I learned what it was like to be a journalist then, that's when the book really took off, because I didn't realize how few, I didn't realize the wide divide in New York City, especially in 1910, between people who had money and women who had money or lived in families that had money and women who didn't. And obviously their lives were a wide divide, but I didn't realize it about a work ethic. I didn't realize how unusual it was for a woman who came from a wealthy family to want to have a career. I mean, you sort of know it, but until you actually start reading about it and the struggle of family deciding that she doesn't want to get married and have a baby, she wants to have a job, how unusual it was. People worked because they had to. There were artists, there were painters and sculptors and, people who wrote novels who didn't have to work. But to do a hard job like being a journalist when you didn't need to do that was pretty unusual. And that sort of, when I found that out, that sort of became the thing that really interested me about her. So who is she? Why does she want to work so badly? And so she really came out of that. And oddly, she resonates more with readers than a lot of the characters that I've written about. And also this was not on purpose, but there's a lot about this book in 1910 that's still going on right now. And I didn't even realize it when I gave my editor the first draft. He pointed it out to me. He said, New York City was a city of haves and have-nots. There were immensely wealthy people and immensely poor people, very much like what we're going through in our country right now. Too many rich people, too many people that have no money. There was a big Me Too problem in 1910. Women were terribly taken advantage of sexually and otherwise. Working as a woman in a pretty much all-male profession was really tough, and it still is. I mean, it's funny because in the 70s and 80s, a lot of these 1970s and 1980s, a lot of these problems weren't as bad as they are now. But they've come back. I mean, abortion is another thing that was an issue then, and it's becoming an issue again. It wasn't in 1980, it wasn't an issue. So there's these huge connections between 1910 and 2020. The book strike chords with people that usually historical fiction doesn't.
Well, another thing that I really find interesting about Vera and her story is that she wanted to be a journalist, and at that time, not only was it difficult for women to break in, to be taken seriously, excuse me, but there were lots of women working as reporters, but it was very soft journalism, if you will. Society pages, things like that. For her to even declare that she wants to be taken seriously as a journalist was a major hurdle just in and of itself.
Right, and that's all based on research, a research assistant for a couple of parts of this book, because I literally couldn't get into certain things that you had to be an accredited researcher to get into. But this wonderful woman who I thank in the back of the book, Stephanie Sporn, she was able to get me a lot of articles that had been written about women who were trying to be serious journalists and their struggles. And then there was this Edna Ferber book that was really, really helpful, because that's what that book was about. It was really interesting because they wanted women to work on the newspaper, to do the ladies' page and the family pages and the style pages. But they really thought hard news, first of all, hard news, the newsrooms, as they still do, waiting into the night to put the paper together for the morning. And they really considered it not a ladylike environment. They didn't want women in the newsrooms. Well, they were smoking and rolled up their shirt sleeves and cursed and did all those things. It wasn't a place for ladies. So that was part of the problem, is they just literally didn't even want them on site. But if women were writing columns that they had time to write, or another thing they had, go to cover court cases, because women were more emotional, and they called them the sob sisters, and they had women write up court cases because women could put in all this Sturm und Drang, and then she walked in and there were tears going down her cheeks. And it was like a really big part of the journal. One way that a woman could write serious journalism was if she did court cases. But that's not what Vera wants to do. Vera wants to do what Nellie Bly was doing, is really put herself into the heart of the story and expose the unfairness of society.
Right. You told me before, MJ, that I think you said, I'm always rewriting The Secret Garden. And, going into this book, I had that idea in the back of my mind that to you, there was almost a perfect story structure. And when I'm reading Vera's story in light of that, I was kind of laughing to myself. I was like, man, this is exactly, this is kind of that hero's journey for Vera. Why is that story structure so perfect to you?
Well, I don't think it's just perfect to me. I think the hero's journey is a lot of the reason that most of us read and watch movies and television is we want to see people overcome obstacles to succeed and go through experiences and come out of them changed for the better, or finding the treasure, I didn't actually remember I had said that to you about The Secret Garden. I mean, it was the first novel that I read, that I remember reading, and one that I've, just totally fell in love with. And I just think that the kind of books that I read that resonate with me are those books. So it's not something that I am conscious of. Since I can see that that's what's going on.
The new book, Cartier's Hope, is available everywhere now in hardback and audiobook and Kindle edition. MJ, I know that you dabble in jewelry making. When focusing on
I dabble in wearing it and buying it.
Oh, this had to be so.
Make it, but no.
Yeah, this had to be so much fun to write. What's next on the horizon for you? What big kind of historical mystery are you digging into now?
Well, I'm actually not big, but I've been writing a column online once every couple of weeks called Lush, which is I find a piece of jewelry that either has an intriguing history or I connect to in an intriguing way, and it's at a website, great newsletter called The Adventurine, and if you just Google that, it'll come up. So those are really fun while I work on my next novel. I just finished the next novel, and I never talk about what the next book is about, other than I will say that it's about a piece of jewelry that's been lost. Something to do with the Romanovs.
Interesting. I'm excited to see what comes next.
Thank you.
MJ, if people are just discovering you and want to dig into all the great stuff you do, Is there a place where they can connect with you online?
Yes, just mjrose.com.
Excellent. We'll put links to everything in the show notes of this episode and send everyone to see you. MJ, so much fun to talk and to catch up. Thank you so much for taking time to come back on the show today.
Thank you, and thank you so much for reading the book, because not every interviewer does that, and it makes for such a better interview, so I really appreciate it.
I don't understand why people don't, but I appreciate the sentiment. Thank you.
Stay tuned now for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Fox's The Ember War.
The near future. Humanity's only hope of survival entered the solar system at nearly the speed of light. The probe slowed as the sun's heliosphere disrupted the graviton wave it rode in on from the abyss of deep space. Awakened by the sudden deceleration, the probe absorbed the electromagnetic spectrum utilized by its target species and assessed the technological sophistication of the sole sentient species on Earth. The probe adjusted its course to take it into the system's primary. If the humans couldn't survive, with its help, what was to come, then the probe would annihilate itself. There would be no trace of it for the enemy, and no chance of humanity's existence beyond the time it had until the enemy arrived. The probe analyzed filed patents, military expenditures, birth rates, mathematical advancement, and space exploration. The first assessment fell within the margin of error of survival and extinction for humanity. The probe's programming allowed for limited, autonomous decision-making, choice being a rare luxury for the probe's class of artificial intelligence. The probe found itself in a position to choose between ending its mission in the sun's fire and a mathematically improbable defense of humanity, and the potential compromise of its much larger mission. Given the rare opportunity to make its own decision, the probe opted to dither. In the week it took to pass into Jupiter's orbit, the probe took in more data. It scoured the internet for factors to add to the assessment, but the assessment remained the same. Unlikely, but possible. By the time it shot past Mars, the probe still hadn't made a decision. As the time to adjust course for Earth or continue into the Sun approached, the probe conducted a final scan of cloud storage servers for any new information, and found something interesting. While the new information made only a negligible impact on the assessment, the probe adjusted course to Earth. It hadn't traveled all this way for nothing. In the desert south of Phoenix, Arizona, it landed with no more fanfare than a slight thump and a few startled cows. Then it broke into the local cell network and made a call. Mark Ibarra awoke to his phone ringing at max volume, playing a pop ditty that he hated with vehemence. He rolled off the mattress that lay on the floor and crawled on his hands and knees to where his cell was recharging. His roommate, who paid the majority of their rent and got to sleep on an actual bed, grumbled and let off a slew of slurred insults. Mark reached his cell and slapped at it until the offending music ended. He blinked sleep from his eyes and tried to focus on the caller's name on the screen. The only people who'd call at this ungodly hour were his family in Basque country, or maybe Jessica in his applied robotics course wanted a late-night study break. The name on the screen was Answer Me. He closed an eye and reread the name. It was way too early, or too late, depending on one's point of view, for this nonsense. He turned the ringer off and went back to bed. Sleep was about to claim him when the phone rang again, just as loudly as last time, but now with a disco anthem. "Seriously?" his roommate slurred. Mark declined the call and powered the phone off. He flopped back on his bed and curled into his blanket. To hell with my first class, he thought. Arizona State University had a lax attendance policy, one which he'd abused for nights like this. The cell erupted with big band music. Mark took his head out from beneath the covers and looked at his phone like it was a thing possessed. The phone vibrated so hard that it practically danced a jig on the floor, and the screen flashed "Answer Me" over and over again as music blared. "Dude," said his roommate, now sitting up in his bed. Mark swiped the phone off the charging cord, and the music stopped. The caller's name undulated with a rainbow of colors, and an arrow appeared on the screen, pointing to the button he had to press to answer the call. "When did I get this app?" he thought. Mark sighed and left the bedroom, meandering into the hallway bathroom with the grace of a zombie. The battered mattress he slept on played hell with his back and left him stiff every morning. Dropping his boxers, he took a seat on the toilet and answered the call, determined to return this caller's civility with some interesting background noise. "What?" he murmured. "Mark Ibarra. I need to see you." The voice was mechanical, asexual in its monotone. "Do you have any friggin' idea what time it is? Wait, who the hell is this?" "You must come to me immediately. We must discuss the mathematical proof you have stored in document title This Can't Be Right, Doc. Mark shot to his feet. The boxers around his ankles tripped him up, and he stumbled out of the bathroom and fell against the wall. His elbow punched a hole in the drywall, and the cell clattered to the floor. He scooped the phone back up and struggled to breathe as a sudden asthma attack came over him. How? He couldn't finish his question until he found his inhaler in the kitchen, mere steps away in the tiny apartment. He took a deep breath from the inhaler and felt the tightness leave his lungs. That someone knew of his proof was impossible. He'd finished it earlier that night and had encrypted it several times before loading it into a cloud file that shouldn't have been linked to him in any way. "How do you know about that?" he asked. "You must come to me immediately. There is little time. Look at your screen," the robotic voice said. His screen changed to a map program, displaying a pin in an open field just off the highway, connecting Phoenix to the suburb of Maricopa. "Come. Now." Mark grabbed his keys. An hour later, his jeans ripped from scaling a barbed wire fence, Mark was surrounded by desert scrub. The blue of the morning rose behind him, where his beat-up Honda waited on the side of the highway. With his cell to his ear, Mark stopped and looked around before deciding how to continue. Spiked ocotillo plants looked a lot like benign mesquite trees in the darkness. A Native American casino in the distance served as his North Star, helping him keep his bearings. "You're not out here, are you? I'm being punked, aren't I?" he asked the mysterious caller. "You are 9.26 meters to my east-southeast. Punk, decayed wood, used as tinder. Are you on fire?" the caller said. Mark rolled his eyes. This wasn't the first time the caller had used the non-standard meanings of words during what passed as conversation between the two. Mark had tried to get the caller to explain how he knew about his theorem and why they had to meet in the middle of the desert. The caller had refused to say anything. He would only reiterate that Mark had to come quickly to see him, chiding him every time Mark deviated from the provided driving directions. "If you're so close, why can't I see you?" he asked. He took a few steps in what he thought was a northwesterly direction and squished into a cow patty.